It was a quiet night, just me, alone at home. The kind of night I normally enjoyed, free of distractions, with time to unwind. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the ticking clock in the hall, ordinary sounds that should have been comforting. My name is Lucas, and I live with my sister and mother, who had gone out that day. I think I was around 17 when that happened. The house, though familiar, seemed different that night, too quiet. I shrugged the thought off. I settled into the couch, scrolling through my phone aimlessly. But as the minutes passed, the weird feeling grew. I told myself it was just the silence getting to me, but deep down, I wasn't so sure. The first noise was faint, almost like a distant click, but it was enough to snap me out of my thoughts. I turned my head toward the hallway, listening closely. A creak followed, soft, deliberate. I stood slowly, my pulse quickening. Moving room to room, I flicked on lights as I went, searching for any signs of disturbance. But everything looked exactly as I'd left it, except for the little things. The living room door, which had been slightly ajar, was now closed. The hallway light flickered just once, then steadied again. The basement door, always locked, stood wide open. None of it made sense, but I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Just as I reached for my phone to call my sister, it went dead. The screen flashed once before going completely black, leaving me alone and disconnected from the world outside. I walked to the nearest window, trying to reassure myself that everything was normal. The street outside was quiet, the same as always. I leaned closer, squinting into the night. Maybe I'd spot my sister's car pulling into the driveway. And then, everything went dark. The house was swallowed by a sudden power outage. No hum of appliances, no flickering streetlights through the windows, just an oppressive darkness that made my skin crawl. Before I could react, a slow, deliberate knock echoed through the silence. It came from somewhere deep inside the house, each knock spaced out, as if whoever or whatever was knocking wanted me to hear every single tap. Then came the shatter, glass breaking somewhere inside. The sound was sharp. I ran without thinking. I found the nearest room, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the door, willing it to hold. The house was silent again, but not in the way it had been before. This silence was alive, filled with tension, as if something was waiting just beyond the walls. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the other side of the door. Creak, pause, and creaked again. Whoever was out there was in no hurry. They moved slowly. I squeezed my eyes shut, knowing that the smallest sound could give me away. Every second stretched. The silence between each step was unbearable, filling my mind with worst-case scenarios. I crouched low, hugging my knees to my chest, praying that the door would hold, and that whatever was out there wouldn't find me. As I sat in the darkness, listening to the slow creak of footsteps outside the door, I had no idea that my sister had just pulled into the driveway. She had taken my car earlier in the evening, planning to return it before midnight. When she arrived, she immediately noticed something strange. The entire house was dark. She frowned, turning off the engine, her fingers drumming nervously against the steering wheel. That's when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. Something was wrong. She didn't waste a second. Reaching for her phone, she quickly called the police, explaining that something strange was happening at her brother's house. Her voice trembled slightly as she told them she feared someone was inside. The dispatcher assured her help was on the way, but waiting felt impossible. Every moment stretched long and thin, and the fear gnawed at her. What if something terrible had already happened? The flashing red and blue lights appeared within minutes, cutting through the darkness like a beacon. Police cruisers surrounded the house with silent precision, officers moving quickly but quietly. From inside my hiding spot, I heard the soft crunch of boots on gravel as the officers approached the house. Flashlights flickered through the windows, sweeping the rooms in wide arcs, their beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. I stayed frozen, listening to the distant sounds of doors opening, furniture shifting, and the occasional murmur of low voices as the officers searched each room. The tension inside me wound tighter with every passing second. I wanted to scream for help, to bang on the door, but fear held me in place, as if speaking would bring the intruder straight to me. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the officers neared my hiding place. I heard one of them mutter something, followed by the familiar click of a flashlight beam hitting the doorknob. I braced myself for whatever came next. The door to my hiding spot burst open, and I gasped, shielding my eyes from the sudden burst of light. "It's okay," a voice called out. "We're the police. You're safe." Relief flooded through me as I stumbled to my feet, my legs shaky from crouching for so long. Two officers stood in the doorway, their expressions calm but alert. "Stay here," one of them instructed before disappearing down the hall. I could hear more officers moving quickly through the house, their footsteps sharp and precise. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, came the sound of a struggle, a thud, followed by muffled shouts. Moments later, the officers returned, dragging a figure between them. The man was gaunt and wild-eyed, his clothes filthy and torn. He thrashed against the officer's grip, muttering incoherently under his breath. It was impossible to tell how long he had been hiding in the shadows, waiting for his moment. Once the intruder was secured and the house swept for any other signs of danger, I was escorted outside. The cool night air felt surreal against my skin, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. My sister rushed toward me, relief flooding her face as she pulled me into a tight hug. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "Thank God." The officers confirmed that the man had been living in the shadows of the house, possibly for days. How he got in and how long he had been lurking were questions that would be answered later, but for now, the important thing was that he had been caught. As we sat on the front steps, waiting for the officers to finish their report, my sister told me how she'd heard the glass shattering and called the police without hesitation. "Something just felt wrong," she said. "I knew I had to act fast." Her quick thinking had likely saved my life. But even with the intruder caught, the unease lingered. Knowing that someone had been inside, moving through the rooms, waiting in the darkness, it left a stain on my mind that wouldn't easily wash away. The officers finally gave us the all-clear, and we watched as the police cars disappeared into the night, taking the intruder with them. But as we stood there, staring at the house, neither of us could bring ourselves to go back inside. Some things leave marks that can't be seen, and fear has a way of settling deep, long after the danger has passed. Even with the lights back on and the silence restored, I knew one thing for certain. I would never feel truly alone in that house again. We stepped off the main road, the sounds of the city above fading as we entered the tunnels just after dusk. The metal grate groaned under our weight, sealing us inside the dark labyrinth beneath the city. Jamie led the way, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating graffiti-splattered walls and rusted pipes overhead. "My name is Peter. I've been a photographer for about 12 years. I really enjoy photographing these hidden places." I'd heard stories about these abandoned tunnels, a forgotten subway line that supposedly connected with drainage systems from another era. Jamie, with his years of experience exploring the city's hidden places, knew these tunnels like the back of his hand. It was my first time going this deep underground, and I was determined to make it count. As we moved further, the air grew cooler, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly around us. Debris littered the ground, broken glass, old wrappers, pieces of decayed wood. It all seemed routine at first, just another urban relic lost to time. We kept going, eager to uncover what lay ahead. About an hour in, we paused to check the map. That's when I heard it, a strange low hum coming from deep within the tunnels. It was faint, almost like the vibrations of machinery buried far beneath the surface, but the sound unsettled me in a way I couldn't explain. "You hear that?" I asked, shining my flashlight down the corridor. Jamie shrugged, brushing it off. "Probably just the wind moving through the pipes." I nodded, but the unease lingered. The further we ventured, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. Shadows stretched along the walls in strange ways, as if they had lives of their own. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often, half expecting to see something move just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam. We stumbled upon the metal door almost by accident, its surface buried beneath layers of dirt and grime. It looked ancient, the kind of thing that had been sealed long ago and forgotten by time. My curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt to brush the dirt away, revealing the corroded edges and an old padlock hanging from the handle. Jamie stood nearby, his flashlight flickering slightly as he scanned the tunnel around us. That's when he froze. I thought I saw. His voice trailed off. What? I swear I saw someone, Jamie muttered, still staring into the shadows. Then, without warning, our flashlights dimmed, flickered, and before I could process what was happening, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the tunnels, so loud it seemed to vibrate the very walls around us. A moment of silence followed, then a voice, low, raspy, and filled with menace. Get out of here, get out. We didn't wait to see what came next. Without a word, we turned and ran, the sound of our boots slapping against the damp concrete echoing around us. Panic fueled every step, making it hard to think straight. We reached the small metal door we had entered through earlier, but it was locked. Jamie rattled the handle desperately, but it wouldn't budge. It was open before, he hissed in disbelief. Behind us, something moved. Footsteps, quick and heavy, growing louder. We couldn't see it, but we knew it was there, coming for us. This way! Jamie grabbed my arm and yanked me toward an alternative route he knew from past explorations. We sprinted through the tunnels, the sound of pursuit closing in behind us. Every step felt like a countdown, as if the walls themselves were conspiring to trap us. At last, we saw it, a ladder leading up to a manhole. Our way out. Jamie reached the ladder first, scrambling up with practiced ease. His boots clanged against the rusted metal rungs as he climbed toward the surface. Come on, Leo, he called down urgently, his voice strained with fear. I grabbed the first rung, my hands shaking, and started pulling myself up. The adrenaline masked the burn in my muscles as I climbed, desperate to reach the safety above. But just as I got halfway up the ladder, something cold and bony wrapped around my ankle. I looked down, and my heart nearly stopped. A gaunt, filthy man stood at the base of the ladder. His clothes hung off him in tatters, and his skin was stretched too tightly over his bones, as if he hadn't eaten in weeks. He didn't speak, just stared at me with a strange mixture of desperation and malice. Then he pulled. Panic surged through me as I clung to the ladder, kicking frantically at the man below. His grip was unnervingly strong. My flashlight tumbled from my hand, clattering uselessly to the ground below. "Jamie!" I shouted, my voice ragged with fear. I kicked again, harder this time, my boot slamming into the man's face. He let out a low grunt, but didn't let go. With one last, desperate kick, I struck him square in the jaw, and his grip finally loosened. He stumbled back into the shadows. I wasted no time, scrambling up the rest of the ladder as fast as I could. Jamie reached down and grabbed my arm, hauling me through the manhole. The metal cover scraped loudly as he slammed it shut behind us. We collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath. The night air was cool against my skin, a sharp contrast to the stale, suffocating air of the tunnels below. I lay there for a moment, staring up at the distant city lights, trying to convince myself that we were safe. Jamie sat up beside me, wiping the sweat from his brow. "You okay?" he asked, his voice shaky but steady. I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. Yeah, I think so." We both sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the city, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of pedestrians, the occasional honk of a car horn. It felt surreal, as if we had been gone for days instead of just a few hours. We sat on the curb, processing what had just happened. Neither of us spoke for a while, but I could see the same question lingering in Jamie's eyes, the same question that had taken root in my mind. Who was that man? And how had he survived down there? "Do you think he lives there?" I asked finally, breaking the silence. Jamie shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Maybe. There are people who disappear into places like that. They don't come back up." The thought chilled me. The idea that someone could survive down there, hidden from the world, haunting the labyrinth of tunnels beneath the city. It was unsettling, to say the least. And then there was that voice, the warning. "Get out of here," I whispered, the words heavy on my tongue. "You think he was trying to warn us? Or scare us?" Jamie shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Leo, but whatever it was, I think we were lucky to get out when we did." We stayed there for a while longer, neither of us ready to leave just yet. The city felt different now, less familiar, more distant. As if, beneath the bright lights and busy streets, another world was waiting, hidden just out of sight. When we finally stood and walked away, I knew one thing for sure. I would never go back into those tunnels. Whatever was down there, whatever lived in those shadows, belonged to the darkness, and I wasn't about to disturb it again. But as we disappeared into the crowded streets, the unsettling thought stayed with me. The man was still down there, waiting. And if we hadn't escaped when we did, I wasn't sure we ever would have. We arrived at the campsite just before noon, the forest welcoming us with a cool breeze and the scent of pine. Setting up the tents was easy, and soon a fire crackled in the pit, smoke curling toward the treetops. It felt good to be out here, surrounded by friends, disconnected from the pressures of daily life. I had spent most of my life buried in work, hospital shifts that bled into one another, endless patients, and the constant hum of stress. But that was behind me now. Retirement at 28 wasn't what I'd planned, but after years of running on empty, it felt right. This camping trip was supposed to be a step towards something new, a chance to reset. The day passed slowly, the kind of slow that feels luxurious. We hiked along a nearby trail, joked around the campfire, and shared stories that drifted between silly and serious. The forest, vast and ancient, surrounded us like a wall, cutting us off from the rest of the world. It was exactly what I needed, until things began to shift. The first strange sound came in the late afternoon, a faint rustling in the distance. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Forests are full of life, after all. Animals scurry, branches snap, and leaves rustle. But this was different. The sound wasn't random. It had a rhythm, as if something or someone was moving with purpose between the trees. Probably just a deer, someone suggested, and the rest of us nodded, eager to believe it. We went back to what we were doing, stoking the fire, roasting food, and passing around a flask of whiskey. The laughter returned, but the unease lingered, like a splinter buried just beneath the skin. As night settled over the campsite, the forest grew unnervingly quiet. The usual background hum of crickets and owls was gone, replaced by a silence so complete it pressed against us. Then we heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of people running through the forest. The footsteps were distant at first, but they grew louder, faster, as if whoever was running was in a desperate hurry. We froze, straining to listen, but just as quickly as the sound had come, it disappeared into the night, leaving only silence in its wake. We exchanged uneasy glances, the fire's glow flickering across our faces. No one wanted to say it aloud, but we all felt the same creeping dread. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. Eventually we retreated to our tents, the weight of the silence pressing down on us. Sleep came in restless bursts, broken by every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. I lay awake for hours, listening to the forest and waiting for the footsteps to return. They never did, but the sense of unease clung to me like a second skin. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was exhausted. But curiosity gnawed at me. What had we heard last night? Who or what had been running through the forest? We had to find out. After a quick breakfast, we decided to retrace the path we'd taken the previous day, hoping to find some clue about the strange noises. The forest felt different in the daylight, less threatening, but still unsettling. We moved slowly, scanning the ground for any signs of disturbance. It didn't take long to find them. Branches snapped underfoot, patches of dirt scuffed and uneven, and scattered footprints too faint to identify. Whatever had passed through here had done so in a hurry. I felt my heart rate pick up, the familiar hum of adrenaline creeping in, just like it had during my years in the ER. We followed the trail deeper into the woods, tension building with every step. The forest seemed to close in around us, the air thick with anticipation. And then we saw her, a woman lying in the underbrush. The sight of the woman stopped us in our tracks. Her body lay twisted in the underbrush, her face pale, streaked with dirt and fear. I rushed to her side, the instincts I thought I'd left behind kicking in without hesitation. Kneeling beside her, I gently touched her shoulder, trying to assess her condition. Her ankle was swollen and discolored, clearly sprained. There were cuts along her arms and legs, some shallow, others deeper, with dirt embedded in the wounds. She looked up at me with eyes wide from fear and exhaustion, struggling to catch her breath. "Who did this to you?" I asked instinctively, though the answer was irrelevant for now. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words came out disjointed, fragments of a nightmare she was still trapped in. "Help, someone," she whispered between gasps. I nodded, suppressing the questions swirling in my mind. "First things first, stabilize her." I grabbed the first aid kit from my pack and wrapped her ankle, immobilizing it with whatever supplies I had. The cuts on her arms and legs were dirty, so I carefully cleaned and dressed them, all the while aware of how exposed we were out here in the forest. She wouldn't be able to walk out on her own. We would have to carry her. Two of us took turns carrying her, struggling under her weight as we moved through the forest. The terrain wasn't forgiving. Twisted roots and uneven ground forced us to slow our pace, each step an exercise in endurance. My shoulders burned, but I pushed the discomfort aside, knowing we had no other choice. The forest around us remained eerily quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Every rustle of leaves made my heart skip, and I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking behind us. The hours stretched, and the exhaustion dragged us down with each passing minute. We swapped places when one of us grew too tired, but it was clear that fear drove us more than anything. We had to reach the road before whatever had chased her found us too. The woman remained quiet, her face tight with pain, but I could tell she was holding back. Whatever had happened to her in the night was more than just a chase. It had left an invisible mark, one we couldn't see but could feel in the way she trembled at every noise. Finally, the forest thinned, and the sight of the road filled me with relief. We loaded her into the car and headed straight for the nearest hospital, hoping the worst was behind us. The emergency room buzzed with quiet efficiency as we carried her inside. A nurse rushed over, and within moments, they wheeled her away on a stretcher, leaving us standing in the waiting room, breathless and drained. We sank into the plastic chairs, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. The sterile lights overhead felt harsh after hours in the dim forest, and the hum of conversations around us seemed distant, like a sound from another world. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment, but all I could see was the forest, the tangled roots, the endless trees, and the woman's frightened face. We had done everything we could to connect, but the unease clung to me, refusing to let go. One of the nurses approached us after what felt like hours, her voice soft and reassuring. "She'll be okay," she said. "We're keeping her overnight for observation, but her injuries are non-life-threatening." Even after all this, we felt relieved, glad that everything was okay with her and that we did what we had to do. I'd been itching to get on the road for weeks, just me, my truck, and a couple of nights sleeping in the back with nothing but the sound of the tires on the asphalt. I wasn't headed anywhere in particular, just needed to clear my head and get some space from everything. It felt good to be alone, like I could finally breathe again. No emails, no meetings, just the open road stretching out in front of me. The day started out perfect, rolling hills, endless fields, and the kind of quiet that makes you forget how loud life usually is. I'd stop here and there at gas stations, grabbing a snack or stretching my legs, enjoying the little moments. But as the sun started to set, things changed. I misjudged how far the next town was, and before I knew it, the highway ahead turned into a long stretch of nothingness. The GPS chirped with a suggestion, a rest area a few miles off the main road. I figured I'd pull in, sleep in the back, and hit the road again at first light. I followed the narrow highway exit and soon saw the sign, Rest Area 16B. The lot was small, with just a few scattered spaces, half lit by a single flickering lamp. One other car sat at the far end, a beat-up sedan. I parked closer to the middle, not wanting to look like I was hiding, but not too far from the exit either, just in case. The place gave off weird vibes, one of those heavy silences where even the air feels thicker. I locked the doors, threw a blanket in the truck bed, and told myself it was nothing. This was the kind of stuff you deal with when you travel solo. No big deal. I managed to drift off for a bit, but something woke me up. Not a loud noise, just a shift, like the air had changed. I lay there for a second, listening. The truck bed creaked as I shifted under the blanket, and that's when I heard it. Tap. It was soft at first, just a light, deliberate tap against the side of the truck. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe some gravel kicked up or a branch swayed in the breeze. But there wasn't any wind. Then it came again. Tap, tap. Slow, methodical, like someone testing how much noise they could make without waking me. My pulse started to race, but I stayed still, straining to listen. The tapping moved, first near the rear tire, then by the driver's side. It wasn't random. Whoever was out there knew what they were doing. I lay frozen, clutching my phone. No service. Of course. This part of the highway was a dead zone. My hands were shaking as I slid out of the blanket and onto the cold bed of the truck, trying not to make a sound. The taps shifted again, this time closer to the cab window. Heart hammering, I crept to the front of the truck and peeked out the side window. At first I couldn't see much, just the flickering street light, the other car sitting dead still at the far end of the lot, and shadows pooling everywhere the light didn't reach. But then something moved. A figure. He was standing near the other car, almost blending into the night, tall, with his hands buried deep in his pockets and a hood pulled over his head. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel him looking my way. My throat went dry. I ducked back down, heart slamming against my ribcage. What the hell was he doing out there? Why wasn't he moving? Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. It was hard to tell. Then I heard it again. Tap. This time, it was on the passenger side window. I couldn't stop myself. I peeked out again, and he was halfway across the lot now, walking slowly toward me. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to check the locks. Everything was still secure. But that didn't matter. He was getting closer. My brain screamed for me to turn on the engine and drive, but my hands wouldn't move fast enough. He reached the side of the truck, standing just outside the window. His breath fogged the glass as he leaned in, like he was trying to see if I was still inside. And then, with one knuckle, he tapped again. Every nerve in my body was screaming to get out of there, but I couldn't seem to move. It was like my brain was stuck in a loop, weighing every bad option. If I stayed still, would he leave? Or was he waiting for me to make the first move? Then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear any sign of him moving, but all I got was silence. My stomach churned with fear, and my hands felt like blocks of ice as I reached for the ignition. My thumb fumbled over the key, slipping once, twice, before I finally got it turned. The engine roared to life, shattering the quiet. My headlights burst on, cutting through the dark lot, and that's when I saw it. The man was gone. The other car, too. The lot was completely empty, as if no one had ever been there in the first place. But I knew what I saw. He'd been standing there, watching. I didn't wait to figure it out. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of the rest stop, tires kicking up gravel as I shot back onto the highway. The glow of the streetlights faded fast behind me, swallowed up by the night. I drove until the sun started to rise, pulling into the first gas station I saw. I sat there in the parking lot for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened, but the only thing I knew for sure was that it wasn't just in my head. I've been on a lot of road trips, slept at a lot of sketchy rest stops, but nothing has ever felt like that night. I don't know what that guy wanted or why he left. But I do know one thing. I'll never stop at another rest area again. It wasn't supposed to be anything special. Just me, Olivia, and Nick out for a weekend hike, trying to take advantage of the last few days of summer before everything started back up again. We'd been planning to hit some easy trails, set up a little campsite, and call it a night. But Nick had this great idea to explore off the trail, convinced we'd find some old ranger cabin he'd heard about online. The cabin was supposedly abandoned years ago, way off any marked paths. No big stories attached, just one of those things people bring up in local forums, more curiosity than legend. Olivia rolled her eyes at the whole idea, but I wasn't about to say no. It sounded like a good way to kill time and make things interesting. The first couple of hours were fine. Lots of winding trails, a few scrambles over rocks, and plenty of joking around. But as we got deeper into the forest, things started to feel off. The air grew still, and the forest, usually buzzing with life, fell into this weird silence. It was subtle at first, like the birds just forgot to sing, but after a while it felt unnatural. We pressed on with Nick leading the way, convinced we were close. I didn't say anything, but something about the whole situation made my stomach knot up. It was like the forest didn't want us there. Olivia started checking her phone every few minutes, annoyed that she lost service. Finally, we saw it. The cabin. It sat slumped at the edge of a clearing, half hidden behind tangled branches and overgrown weeds. The wood looked bleached by the sun, cracked and peeling, with ivy crawling up the walls. It didn't feel like we were the first to find it, but it didn't look like anyone had been here in years. "This is it," Nick said with a grin, pulling out his phone to snap some pictures. Olivia huffed and leaned against a tree, clearly over the whole thing. We pushed open the door, and it groaned on its rusty hinges. Inside, it was what you'd expect. Damp air, the faint scent of rot, and old furniture falling apart. But then we noticed the weird stuff. In the corner there were old backpacks, 3 of them, tossed haphazardly like someone left in a hurry. A pair of hiking boots sat near the door, still covered in dried mud. The air inside was thick, like the room had trapped everything from whoever had been here last. "People probably squatted here," I said. Nick shrugged, not bothered at all, but Olivia looked uneasy. She stayed close to the door while Nick poked around, picking up old cans and half-rotten clothes like they were souvenirs. That's when we heard it, the distinct crunch of footsteps outside. We all froze, exchanging glances. "Did you hear that?" Olivia whispered. Nick peeked out the window. Probably just an animal, but the steps kept coming, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. Someone was out there. Without saying a word, I grabbed Olivia's arm and pulled her toward the back door. Nick followed, his carefree attitude gone. We crept outside, trying to move quietly, but every step seemed louder than the last. As we slipped into the forest, I glanced back, and that's when I saw him. He was tall, gaunt, and moved like he didn't care if we knew he was there. His clothes were stained with dirt and sweat, and his eyes looked sunken, almost hollow. "Go," I hissed, shoving Olivia ahead of me. We ran. Branches whipped at our faces, and the undergrowth snagged at our legs, but we didn't stop. Behind us, the man followed, his footsteps steady and relentless. He wasn't chasing us. He was hurting us, like he knew exactly where we'd end up. Panic started setting in, and Olivia tripped, hitting the ground hard. Nick helped her up, and we kept running, lungs burning, hearts pounding. The forest twisted around us, every direction looking the same. I could hear him behind us, close enough that I could almost feel his breath on my neck. We broke into a small clearing and stopped, gasping for air. But before we could figure out which way to go, the man stepped out from the trees. "Lost, huh?" he said, his voice dry like cracked leaves. We didn't answer. We just stood there, frozen in place, trying to figure out what the hell to do. Then he lunged. I shoved Olivia toward the trees, and we ran again, faster this time. I could hear Nick behind us, his footsteps uneven as he tried to keep up. The man's laughter followed us, a low, eerie chuckle that echoed through the forest. The ground sloped downward, and we stumbled into a dry creek bed. For a moment, I thought we'd lost him. But then Olivia cried out. Her ankle twisted, and she went down hard. Nick grabbed her arm and pulled her up. "We gotta keep moving," he shouted. I looked around, desperate for a way out, and spotted a narrow path winding up the hill. "This way." We scrambled up the slope, dirt slipping beneath our feet. The man was still behind us, but the sound of his footsteps grew fainter. By the time we reached the top, the forest was quiet again, too quiet. We kept moving, every nerve on edge, until we finally saw the trailhead up ahead. I almost cried with relief. We burst out of the forest and collapsed onto the gravel path, gasping for breath. Olivia clutched her ankle, wincing in pain, but we didn't have time to rest. Nick helped her to her feet, and we made our way down the trail toward the parking lot. When we finally reached the car, none of us spoke. We just climbed inside and locked the doors, as if that would somehow keep the forest and the man out. I turned the engine over, and we sped away, leaving the trail behind. But even as we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't really escaped. The man had let us go, and that was almost worse. Because now we knew, some places aren't abandoned, and some people never really leave.